We're going to have to pick up where some of us have already discussed. So we'll pick up here with this cross of gold speech. There's not much left, as you can see. We'll get to these next few slides hopefully in 30 minutes or so. However, we're going to move at a fast pace because you don't have the opportunity to ask questions, but you do have the opportunity to stop the recording and go back and listen. So we'll move pretty fast here, but let's pick up here with Brian's Cross of Gold speech. Obviously, there's, when you read through, there's obviously a populist agenda here in support of the agrarian power, the agrarian economy's power, over the industrial power. And he's more of a Jeffersonian idea that without that agricultural portion of our economy, the country would collapse in total, including that industrial power that's been built. And then at the end, Brian's evangelical Protestantism is revealed with the parallel here, the reference or correlation analogy of this gold crucifying the laborer as the Romans crucified Jesus Christ. Again, the crowd went crazy. Brian gets the nomination of the Silverites. The Gold Democrats went with their own candidate, John Palmer, as was on the board, as might still be on the board if you look up, who will go on to say, Palmer that is, to his fellow Democrats, I will not consider it any fault if you cast your vote for William McKinley. So the extent of that divide, the Populist Party, the Democratic Party in '96 was severe and significant, so much so that the Gold Democrats were shifting their vote Republican. And that being said, we'll see Brian's success, even if it is a loss, in this election, during which he ran around the country spreading his message to as many people as he could see, 18,000 miles, 600 speeches, a record 36 in one day, convincing farmers that silver was the answer and that the nation was in a struggle against the gold-controlling Eastern elite. Where he found support in the populist base, of course, and not so much in the South. His evangelical bend alienated the Catholics and pushed that vote towards the Republican, as we may have mentioned in some classes. The populists find themselves in a tricky spot in 1896, but again show some pretty shrewd political acumen in delaying their own national convention, a tradition that party started, remember, in '92, and gambling, the populists that is, that the issue would be silver, and that both Democrats and Republicans would split on that issue, creating two factions. It was a misread with the Republicans, who all support gold, and after the Democratic convention, a misread for the Democrats, who mostly got in line behind William Jennings Bryan as this dark horse candidate, this charismatic speaker. So after that selection by the Democrats, the populists find themselves in a bit of a pickle, big backfire for their plan. So what now? They either put up their own candidate and compete with Bryan for silver votes, and knowing his oratorical skills and political acumen, the populists knew they probably couldn't compete. So that's option one. Option two, endorse Bryan and lose their identity as a political party, just kind of merge with the Democrats, which, at the early stages of any movement was not really an option. So the compromise between those two was suggesting their own candidate for vice president, and that's Thomas Watson, who's on the board. Some of us have that down. Watson was the populist compromise to Bryan to split that ticket and really solidify, amalgamate all those silver votes, to which Bryan, of course, had to say no. As a Democrat, giving up half that ticket to the populists would be political suicide for him. So Bryan's answer of no is really the beginning of the end of the Populist Party, and we won't see them down the road after 1896. This cartoon kind of sums up his campaign. We've got the reference to the gold and silver issue, the suitcase and umbrella reference to his travel around the country, and still just being locked out of the White House and alienated from those who control the government and that White House and big business. Our Republican candidate, McKinley, the 25th president of the United States, took a completely different approach to the campaign. Obviously pro-gold, obviously pro-tariff, pro-big business, more of a Hamiltonian supporter of industry, if we're referencing a founding father comparison between the two. Jeffersonian Bryan, Jeffersonian populist, agrarian culture, Hamiltonian Republicans at this stage, supporter of industry, supporter of international trade in the United States, expanding their grip on the global economy. So McKinley believes it's going to be all about the tariff. His advisors disagree. His advisors know this election has to be controlled, as McKinley up against Bryan in a public speaking setting would end in disaster for the Republicans. So where Bryan's running around the country, McKinley stays home. The front porch campaign. Marcus Hanna on the right there, his campaign manager, controls the media throughout the country, hires 1,400 speakers to travel the country on McKinley's behalf and spread the message. The newspapers had the Republican message in it, and of course alienated the Democratic message, as Hanna controlled that media, spending $7 million on their campaign. So the Republicans in '96 spent $7 million. The Democrats spent $300,000. So clearly, the Republican Party has the financial backing of industry, of big business, and the gold-holding bankers in the Eastern elite, Eastern Seaboard. Excuse me. And the Republicans have a pretty simple message in '96, as we may have said, that the tumult of Cleveland's administration was because of Democratic policies. We had internal strife with revolts and protests, labor strife with militia and assassination attempts. We had inflation, the agrarian sector collapsing, mass immigration that was causing competition, a lot going wrong from the Democrats in 1896. And that's the message here from these two. Everything is blamed on the Democrats. Along the way, that party, Bryan, loses ground. The wheat prices rose a little bit across the country and eased some of the pain for the farmers. The industry owners, employers, just simply scared their workers. You want to go back to the farms and return 200 years ago and be a farmer like Jefferson, then vote for Bryan. And that message really resonated in the inner cities. Coupled with two other things, the northeastern farmers are not as radical, as they didn't have the same situation, a little closer to the cities, closer to the industry, and that middleman issue wasn't as pressing for the northeast, so it was hard to just unify that agrarian sector. Along with, as we mentioned, Bryan's strong evangelical Protestantism repelling the Catholic votes. In the end, will lead to this electoral college spread. 7 million for McKinley popular and 6 million for Bryan. So a fairly substantial win for McKinley, the quiet front porch candidate who controlled his campaign to the T, or had it controlled for him, we should say. But speaking more to the turning point of this election, this defeat really signifies and marks the triumph of big business over the government and big business control over the western farmers of the country. We also see a turning point in the sense that the populists are gone. And more to that, a turning point issue, gold is controlling the country. And we see the Republicans Party really go through a shift, as we see the Democrats. So for the Republican shift, if we speak for a second on the significance of the election and the shift in the two parties, one, the Gilded Age politics is over. Patronage, spoil system, graft. We see a much more complex form of corruption from this point going forward, but that patronage and spoil system is kind of over. For the Republican Party specifically, they're entering another era of dominance, and we'll see that play out over the next couple of chapters. We see them shift from a party of free soil and no slavery to a party of business, industry, and a strong national government that's going to flex its muscles all over the world with imperialism in the next section. And some critics will say that the Republicans shifted from a party of no slavery and free soil to a party of slavery, not slavery of the working industrial laborers in the urban centers. For the Democrats, Bryan's loss in '96 is at times viewed as a catalyst of change for the Democratic Party, as they shift eventually to becoming more of a party of liberal reform, which we mentioned on our spectrum chart, and the party of public welfare, the party of really going from that hateful democratic control of the South prior to eventually becoming the party of the people and more reform movements. And that's the beginning of the shift we mentioned in the beginning of class of the Democratic South and Republican North. This election really is the beginning of that change. From here, the silver and gold issue is kind of over and dead. The nation found more gold, discovered gold in Alaska, Canada, South Africa, took care of the country's financial needs. The treasury is flooded with gold with this new money reserve. Brian won't let it go for the next two elections, but really, practically, that issue is kind of over. The racism in the South, the white supremacism in the South will spike again as Southern Democrats look to solidify their control. And this just kind of sums up what we were saying before. And the United States emerges from this first modern election. When we say modern, because of the money spent on the control of the media, as the world's power, and looks to flex that muscle all over the world and become a player in the international imperialistic scene. And that's what this is just referencing here, that new navy that's going to be built by the next administration that will go on and imperialize the world. And of course, the need for new markets to feed that industrial beast plays into that imperialism, which we'll go into much further later. All right, so for this here, why are we looking at the Wizard of Oz? Well, this is really a populist story. It was written by a guy from the Midwest. His name was Frank Baum. In the 1890s, he was an activist for the silver and gold dispute. He was the editor of a newspaper, and this was first published in 1900. So it really is a comparison to the populist movement and the political situation in the country in this time period. So clearly we have Dorothy from Kansas representing that populist class. She had been led astray and seeking her way back home to the city, which of course along that Gold Road represents the migration to the east after that 1893 panic. And Kansas was on purpose. There was a saying, "In God we trusted, in Kansas we busted." Kansas was supposed to be the place where the agricultural sector could flourish, grow, and develop, and people could make fortunes. And of course that didn't happen. In Kansas alone, 11,000 farms foreclosed. So she's representing that populist base and that drifting, looking for answers in the big cities, which of course she finds corruption and greed and self-serving politicians, which is represented by the corrupt wizard who knows he's bad, admits he's bad, feels selfish and guilty about it, but eventually will send Dorothy back west to get rid of his enemy, the populist base, the Wicked Witch of the West, representing that movement of the agrarian class. If we look at the Tin Man, he's the representative of the urban workers, the industrialism of the age. The Scarecrow, obviously, the farmers and the struggles that they faced in the late 19th century, and them being depicted as a little backwards. Let's go back to that Grange and why that movement started in 1866. And the Lion, of course, is the mockery of William Jennings Bryan, big mouth but scared in the end, really empty message. And that cyclone in the beginning of the Wizard of Oz is often used as a political metaphor for revolution that would transform the country. And really what was Cleveland dealing with? Coxey's army could be symbolized by that metaphor in the of that cyclone and tornado in the beginning of that film. So there's much more you can find if you want to delve further into the populist Wizard of Oz. The last thing we'll talk about is race relations in the 1890s. And we'll go back a little bit. Obviously, civil rights fell victim to the social, economic, and political forces of the rapid industrial growth that was the end of Reconstruction, as many of us noted in our LEQs over the summer. We see a spike in Jim Crow, especially after that 1892 election with the first showing of the Populist, which is mandates separate but equal, culminating in that case at the federal level of Plessy v. Ferguson. We might know or have been told the name Jim Crow laws that signifies separate but equal laws derives from a name from a song and dance caricature of African Americans by a white actor, Thomas D. Rice, of that time. But it really led to tough situations and white thugs alienating African Americans in every sense of society. And this populist revolt made Southern whites go Democratic and create even more tension in the end, especially as some of those African Americans did gravitate towards the Populist Party. And that African American vote was pretty significant at this time, as both parties kind of vied for that those numbers at the poll box. That really after 1892, that vote could have gone either way. And some populist leaders, we said, historians believe went after that, and some didn't. Maybe it was implied in their message. Either way, many forms and attempts at disenfranchisement of the African American population in the South. And what we mean by this is legal devices to quell the African American vote. And there were many, many evil ways. A poll tax to pay to vote. And of course, if you're a poor farmer, you can't afford it. Literacy tests. You can't read, you can't vote. There was violence at the toll booths, just beating people away physically. Other disenfranchisements may have been a grandfather clause. If your grandfather could vote, you could vote. And of course, newly freed African Americans, previous generation, were not in a position to vote, so that alienated more of those voters. And of course, we're talking about from 1870 on. That's the 15th Amendment, which granted all males suffrage in the United States. So probably the biggest, or one of the most hateful and best examples of that disenfranchisement is Mississippi's attempt in 1890 to rewrite their constitution, to change suffrage provisions in the radical Republican Constitution of 1869, which of course would open doors. This, however, required residents to be able to vote. If you were convicted of certain crimes typically committed by the African American population, you could not vote. There was poll tax involved and a literacy test. So 1890 in Mississippi really restricted voting, and it set the pattern for 7 more states over the next 20 years throughout the Deep South to restrict African American suffrage with new constitutions based on the Mississippi Plan of 1890, which was really the second plan in the South. Really 1870s, 1875, 77, after the Union leaves the South, white Southern Democrats intimidated voters with violence right from the start and tried to keep them out of the voting loop. And these, we should know, we're not going to, this is a typo actually, 1883, I apologize. These cases go down in history as a collection of roughly 5 separate civil rights cases that reached the court in 1883. Then the culmination of which was the determination by the court that the 14th Amendment was unconstitutional. And of course, that's equal protection, and it reads to the states. It speaks of only the states. So the court decided that private organizations and individuals can discriminate based on race, religion, etc. So a huge setback in 1883, and then of course again culminating in 96 with Plessy, that on the federal level made separate but equal legal. And that's Homer Plessy, 1892. He gets on a train in Louisiana as an octoroon, and 1/8 of his lineage traced back to African American roots. You can see him there, and he's arrested. It goes to the Supreme Court that decided in a 7-1 decision to legalize separate but equal. 7-4. Only one dissenter, Justice John Marshall Harlan of Kentucky, a former slave owner, who argued that the Constitution is colorblind and doesn't know or tolerate classes. So in his dissension, he was saying that the ruling will plant the seeds of race hate for years to come, which of course it did. And this will not be overturned until 54 with Brown v. Board of Ed, and even from 54 on in that civil rights struggle there's a lot of violence and hatred and work left that continues today. For example, early on in the 1890s, Jim Crow violence spiked. 188 incidents per year in the United States. 82% of those were in the South. Lynchings, this stat is specifically for lynchings from 1890 to 99. In that one decade, the country averaged 188 per year, 82% of which were in the South. And from 1900 to 1909, that did not decrease by much, 93 per year, 92% of which were in the South. And they almost became, these lynchings, a medieval specter and a sport, and more on the civil rights struggle as we move on through our course. But there were really a couple limited options for African Americans. Obviously, one, run away, and two, adapt, which was really the only viable option, with nowhere to go, no funds to get there, and no place that would allow for any other freedoms, really. And we'll talk about that the hatred that was present in the North as we get to the 1920s. So some did manage to leave, most stayed, and most adapt. Most tried to keep the culture separate and distinct from the white world of torture and hate that surrounded the African American community. And for that, the church really emerged as a major organization of not only religious support and hope, but also a political institution that allowed for social gatherings, clubs, rallies, and leadership roles for men to practice and extend their political skill to fight for equality down the road. And all of this, of course, within that church organization, exercising the rights that were denied in that southern hateful white world. And we talked about this a little bit. I know when we mentioned the Jim Crow earlier, with the increased economic opportunities. Can't go to the white store, open up the black store, open up the African American schools, and set a foundation for economic and educational success. Also, we see, before we get to the NAACP, we see African American women thrive, founding many social and racial organizations to uplift the African American population throughout the South. And in fact, before we get to the NAACP, we should mention in 1896, the National Association of Colored Women was founded first. So the women striking first in 1896, the National Association of Colored Women, which is followed by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909. That symbol there. Now, we've mentioned already, when movements get violent, they disband, they set back, they lose momentum. And the civil rights movement is not immune to that, which we'll go over in the 1960s. Another issue that tends to derail any movement from making progress would be differences of opinion in the direction the group should follow. And we have that very early on in the struggle for equality from African Americans in the United States. And two brilliant men sharing different views, two brilliant leaders sharing different views. Booker T. Washington, we'll go over more of this in detail later, but Booker T. Washington, as a civil rights leader, looks for three things: conciliation, separatism, and economic opportunities. So in that context of options early on, Booker T. Washington would say to keep the culture distinct, keep the culture separate, and work to develop those newly found economic opportunities, set an economic foundation that can then be used to advance education and political skill to then fight for equality. And again, more on this later, but that opinion differed 180 degrees from the opinions of W.E.B. Du Bois, who was more militant and wanted to fight for equality now. He believed in assimilation, where the races should be blended together and on par and equal in every sense. And he also fought for social justice, or was calling for social justice. And the debate between these two gentlemen is going on in the late 1800s. At the same time, the debate between Bryan and McKinley is going on about gold and silver and questions of economic depression and the populist movement and agrarian versus industrial. It's all happening at the same time. It really started in 1895 by Washington's speech at the Cotton States and International Exposition in Atlanta in 1895. He made a famous speech there where he said that the community should stay separate but distinct and advance the race to work and prosper alongside whites economically first. And of course, Du Bois's answer to that was that this was the Atlanta Compromise, and that we should fight for, that African Americans should fight for equality right from that juncture on. And we'll talk more about them both later as we get to that part of our curriculum. Okay, so let's sum up the populist movement before we end for the chapter. The populist philosophy drew heavily upon that democratic republican, that Jeffersonian ideology, Jeffersonian Madison, we should say, from the early days of our country. They believed in a government by and for the people then. They believed in an agrarian society. They believed in 1896, obviously, gold and silver. They also then pushed the idea that the people are not only sovereign in control of their government, but sovereign over the economy and must structure that market for the common good. That this populist idea about the economy and control of that economy in this free world, that the people have the responsibility to control and structure that economy so that everyone benefits, not just the 1%, as we call it today, not just the eastern elite and the banks controlling the gold, the corporate robber barons like Morgan, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, Rockefeller, etc. So in that context, the populist support is not towards business, obviously it's towards organized labor, it's towards the unions, it's towards the working person, it's towards the agrarian laborer out on the farms that Brian's speaking to in that screenshot right there. So keep your questions, be ready for your questions on Monday. We'll go over them. We'll have some time to go over questions from the chapter and prepare for the test that we'll take on Tuesday, Wednesday of next week. And with that, we'll sign off and see everyone on Monday. Thank you.